There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. And so now with Jesus on the topic of tombs, Jesus, he starts talking about how they decorated the dead prophets' graves and how they honored all the dead prophets. But it was always the live prophets that they persecuted. And so these Pharisees, they tell each other that they wouldn't have killed these prophets, and they say they wouldn't have acted like their fathers did. Now, when he's talking about their fathers, he's not talking about their biological fathers here. He's talking about their spiritual fathers. And he's talking about the hypocrites and the false prophets from the past ages, the ones of whose traditions they're following, who pass down this form of legalism, of all the customs and all the traditions. And right here, while they're saying that they wouldn't have killed the prophets, they're currently plotting to kill the Son of God, the Messiah. And their fathers are spiritual. They would have never dreamed of doing that. And we do know that after they kill Jesus, they will continue to kill the apostles and the disciples of Jesus, the ones that they can find. And then Jesus, he calls them snakes, and he calls them a brood of vipers. And what he's referring to is he's referring to Satan, and he's calling them children of the devil. And then Jesus tells these men that along with their spiritual fathers, that they will be found guilty of all the murders of all the Old Testament prophets. And he says from Abel all the way to Zechariah. And you kind of think, wow, that's kind of like A to Z, but that's just a coincidence. Abel was in Genesis in the beginning of creation, the son of Adam who was killed by his brother Cain. And Zechariah, he was the last person, the last prophet killed in the Old Testament in 2 Chronicles. And the thing is like 2 Chronicles is actually the last book chronologically in the Bible. So you might think, well, no, that's not the last book. It's Malachi. But it's not. Chronologically, the last thing that happened in the Old Testament was 2 Chronicles. And Jesus tells them that there's going to be this great wrath poured out on these Pharisees when he comes to avenge all his servants' bloods. And he's not saying these things to scare them. And he's not threatening them. What he's doing is he's saying these things to reach them. Because you'll see in the very next line, Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. And then he talks about how they killed all the prophets that he sent to them. And then he tells them how he loves the people of Israel and how his heart has always been wanting to gather them, to gather up their children. And then he compares his love for them of how a mother bird loves and protects its chicks and cares for them. And then he tells them how often he wanted to do this. And Jesus, he'd been back and forth to Jerusalem every feast and everything like that. But then he says, but you are unwilling. And it's because they have free will. And then he tells them, and he says, all they'll have left is the destruction of their house. And what Jesus is referring to here is the destruction of the temple, of what they would consider their house. And that will come in about 35 years, because in 70 AD, the temple will be destroyed along with Jerusalem, and Israel will cease to be a nation. And then Jesus reveals then that he'll be coming back, and that when he comes back, that the Jewish people, Israel, will receive him as their Messiah. So Jesus here, he's talking about his second coming, where the Jews will say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Because in the end, Israel will be saved, and it will be Jesus who saves them. All right. So now we're done kind of with our study, and now we have to look at this, and And we have to look at what Jesus did with warning about the Pharisees. And we can look at it like that and we can miss the whole lesson because it's really easy to look at them and to judge them. But you have to also realize that these guys would have looked like the best Christians around. And we'll often hear about how people, they don't want to attend church because they'll say it's all filled with a bunch of hypocrites. And if you want to see one of those hypocrites, all you need to do is look up here and look at me. Because I believe that inside of each of our heart, we have this little bit of a Pharisee living in it. And in me, I'm not always what I should be. And what you see on the outside doesn't always match what's going on in the inside. So I believe if that also applies to you, we need to pay attention to Jesus' words here. And we need to allow these words actually not just to judge others, but we need to allow them to examine ourselves. Because we too can be blind to ourselves. And just like Jesus, he wanted to gather them, he also wants to gather us. But we have to be willing for him to do that. And so now after this, Jesus, he leaves the temple, he goes towards the Mount of Olives, and this is the last time that he'll ever be at the temple. And so next week, we're going to study the Olivet Discourse. So Jesus, he's leaving the temple, and he will never enter the temple again. And the emphasis on the verb here means he's never to return. And the very first words of chapter 24 is the word then, which is telling us what's happening here is attached to what has just happened in chapter 23. And the last thing that just happened in 23 is Jesus had just made a public statement to Jerusalem telling the crowd, your house is left to you desolate. And they will see Jesus no more until they receive him and they say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And that's talking about Jesus' second coming. And by saying your house is left to you desolate, Jesus is talking about the temple. He's telling them that the temple is going to be destroyed. And so as Jesus and his disciples, they're leaving, and the disciples, they just heard what Jesus had just spoken about the temple. And so now they're showing Jesus how wonderful this temple is and how well it's built. And so what it looks like they're doing is that they're giving Jesus a second chance. They're giving him an opportunity to reconsider what he had just said about the destruction of the temple, that the temple will be left in a desolate condition. Because to these disciples and to anyone else, this would seem impossible. And even though Solomon's temple had been destroyed, Solomon's temple was a much smaller temple. And this temple here, it's now been standing there for over 1,000 years, and it's a much bigger temple and a much grander temple than the original rebuilt temple that was built by Ezra and Zerubbabel after they had returned from the Babylonian exile. And that's because Herod the Great, that same Herod that ruled at Jesus' birth and the one who sent the Magi to Bethlehem in the Christmas story, he's the same one that tried to kill the baby Jesus. Well, he was a great builder. And so he started rebuilding the temple, the 13 acres up on the Temple Mount in the year 19 BC. So this is about 20 years before Jesus was ever born. And that project of rebuilding the temple, it lasted 80 years until it was completed in 63 AD, which is way long after Herod had died. And Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, he wrote that for 8 of those years, that Herod kept 10,000 men working on the temple continually. And so the physical size of that temple became equal to 5 football fields by 4 football fields. So it was 500 yards long by 400 yards wide. And this temple, it was not only big, but it was beautiful. And it was even considered to be more stately than Solomon's temple had been. Because this temple, it was all covered with these gold plates. And when you looked at it in the sunshine, it would have been blinding. And where there were no gold plates, it was pure white marble. And so from a distance, if you were looking up there, it would seem like there was snow on the temple's roof. And so this is that place right now where Jesus and his disciples, they're walking through. And his disciples, they're pointing all this out. And the construction stones and the foundation stones, they were so big, they were like 40 feet by 12 feet by 18 feet high. And they could weigh up to like 400 tons. 400 tons is 800,000 pounds. And so you can understand why the destruction of this temple would have seemed impossible, and how the disciples might have wanted Jesus to reconsider or maybe modify his statement, but he didn't. And after the disciples showed Jesus these buildings, then Jesus told them, he says, it wouldn't only just be destroyed, but Jesus said that not one stone shall be left here upon another, that shall not be thrown down. And at the time when Jesus actually spoke this, the temple wasn't even going to be completed for another 30 years, until 63 AD. And when that temple, when it was finished, it would only stand completed for 7 years before what Jesus had just said would come to pass exactly just as he said it would. So what happened in 40 years after Jesus had made this statement to the disciples? There was a Jewish uprising against Rome in Jerusalem. And although the Jews, they initially had some success, especially in the area of guerrilla warfare, where they would sneak out at night and then they would secretly attack the Romans. But finally, what the Romans started to do is they brought in a lot more troops. They brought in like 60,000 troops from the north, up from the Galilee area. And eventually, they leveled the city of Jerusalem and they killed over 1 million Jews. And with the last of the Jews, what they did is they had fled inside the temple, because the temple was the strongest and the most secure building in the city. And that's where they made their last stand. And nobody wanted the temple to be destroyed. Not even the general Titus, who eventually became the Roman emperor, because he ordered that temple not be destroyed. And he pleaded with the Jews to come out, just not to destroy the temple. But the Roman soldiers at this time, they were so tired of the Jews because of the last 5 months of the Jews killing all their comrades. One drunken soldier randomly just threw a torch into the temple, and the whole temple caught on fire. And it basically just exploded with fire, and it incinerated everyone and everything that was inside. And that fire was so hot that it melted all the gold that covered the outside of the temple. And it also melted all the gold that was inside the temple. And when that gold melted, it all drained between the cracks of the stones of the temple. And you have to understand that a large part of a Roman soldier's wages was what they could carry away and spoil, the treasures that they could capture. And so after the fire and after the burning of the temple, the Roman commander, he ordered the dismantling of the temple stone by stone to be able to retrieve the gold that was between these stones.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.